Sarah, an editor at a major publishing house downtown, was a regular girl who liked to keep things simple. Life had always been a bit of a hustle for her, juggling deadlines and squeezing in some me time. That's probably why she never really got into the dating scene. She usually preferred her own company, a good book, or a quiet walk in the park near her apartment. But everything changed on a sunny Saturday that seemed just like any other. Deeply immersed in a podcast, Sarah strolled along the park path without a care. The park was buzzing with people and their pets, kids running around full of energy. She must have lost track of where she was walking because suddenly, a guy on a bicycle nearly collided with her. "Watch it," he yelled, swerving at the last second. His tone was harsh, and it was clear he was annoyed. Sarah quickly pulled out one earbud and blurted, "I'm so sorry. I didn't realize I'd wandered onto the bike path." He stopped his bike and turned around, looking more amused than angry now. "You've got to watch where you're going. This path's a jungle sometimes." "Yeah, my bad," Sarah admitted, feeling a bit embarrassed. She brushed a stray lock of hair from her face and gave him a sheepish smile. He laughed, and just like that, the tension seemed to dissolve. "I'm Kevin," he said, extending a hand. "Sarah," she replied, shaking his hand. His grip was firm and confident. "So, Sarah, are you always this distracted, or is it just my charming presence?" he asked with a cheeky grin that made her chuckle. "It's just been a long week at work. My brain's already off enjoying the weekend," she said. "Fair enough. I was just about to grab a coffee at that place over there," he said, pointing to a small cafe at the edge of the park. "Care to join me?" "You know, as a peace offering for almost sending me flying." Sarah considered it for a moment. He seemed nice, and honestly, she could use a coffee. "Sure, why not? I could use a good coffee and a story to tell." As they walked to the cafe, Kevin was easy to talk to. He told her about his job at a car sales company and how he liked to spend his weekends biking or hanging out with friends. He wasn't from the city. He moved here because he thought it offered more opportunities. "You know, big city dreams," he said with a smirk. Sarah shared a bit about her job too, explaining how much she loved books and ended up making a career out of that passion. "It beats being stuck in a cubicle doing something you hate," she added. They reached the cafe and ordered their coffee. While they waited, Sarah couldn't help but notice how comfortable she felt around him. It was strange because she's usually a bit reserved around new people, but with Kevin, the conversation just flowed. After meeting Kevin, they started hanging out more. He was funny and easygoing, but it wasn't long before Sarah started noticing little things that bugged her. It was nothing major at first, just small comments here and there that made her raise an eyebrow. On Saturday, they decided to go out for dinner. Somehow, the topic of careers and family came up. They were just chatting about work and life, nothing serious, or so Sarah thought. "So, how's the book world treating you?" Kevin asked, taking a sip of his beer. "It's busy as always." "Deadlines don't stop for anyone," Sarah replied, poking at her salad. "Yeah, I get that. But you wouldn't want to be stuck in that forever, right? I mean, eventually, you'd want to settle down, maybe cut back on work hours," Kevin said casually. Sarah paused, her fork midair. "Not really, Kevin. I love what I do. I don't see myself giving it up anytime soon or ever." Kevin shrugged. "Sure, but what about when we have kids? Wouldn't you want to be around more?" The question caught Sarah off guard. She chuckled nervously. "That's jumping way ahead, don't you think?" He laughed it off. "Yeah, you're right. Just thinking out loud, I guess." Sarah tried to shake off the discomfort, but it lingered. A couple of weeks later, Kevin invited her to have dinner with his parents. She figured it was a good sign, things getting serious and all. Sarah was nervous but hopeful. The dinner, though, opened her eyes a bit more. His parents lived in a cozy, well-kept house in the suburbs. His mom, Mrs. Frank, was all smiles when they arrived. "Sarah, so lovely to finally meet you. Kevin has told us so much about you," she gushed, pulling Sarah into a hug. "Thank you for having me, Mrs. Frank." "It's great to meet you too," Sarah managed to say, returning her smile. Dinner was served, and everything was going well until Mrs. Frank started talking about family and marriage. You know, Kevin was always the responsible one, Mrs. Frank said as she served herself more potatoes. We've always told him the importance of finding a good girl who knows her way around the house. Kevin's dad nodded in agreement. Absolutely. It's about building a good foundation. A man needs to provide, and a woman, well, she takes care of the home. Sarah glanced at Kevin, hoping he'd say something, but he just focused on his food. Mrs. Frank continued. It's how we raised our boys. Family first, right, Kevin? Right, Mom, Kevin said finally, looking up. His agreement felt like a punch to the gut. Sarah tried to stay calm. It's interesting because I've always been pretty career-oriented, she said. I love my job and believe in contributing equally. Mrs. Frank smiled, but it felt a bit too sweet. Of course, dear, but you'll see priorities change when you start having children. It's only natural for a woman to want to stay at home with her babies. The rest of the evening felt like a fog. They left shortly after dinner, and the drive home was tense. Sarah broke the silence. Your mom has some strong opinions about family roles. Kevin hesitated before responding. I think there's some truth to it. I mean, it worked for my parents. Despite the uneasy dinner with Kevin's parents, their relationship continued. Somehow, the good times seemed to outweigh the bad, and Sarah found herself agreeing to marry him. Looking back, love must have blinded her because those warning bells were still ringing in the back of her mind. The wedding planning started, and it was a whirlwind. Kevin wanted something simple, and so did Sarah. They decided on a modest ceremony with just close family and friends. As the day approached, the real pressure began to mount, not about the event itself, but about what their lives would become afterward. At the reception, after the ceremony, Kevin's mom pulled Sarah aside. Her smile was wide, but her eyes were serious. Sarah, dear, I'm so happy for you both. Remember, a good wife supports her husband no matter what. Thank you, Mrs. Frank. I intend to be a supportive partner, Sarah replied, trying to keep her voice steady. And remember, dear, when the babies start coming, it's best if you're at home. You can't trust strangers to raise your children. Her words felt like a warning, and the finality in her tone made Sarah's stomach churn. She just nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Later, Kevin and Sarah had a moment alone. Your mom talked to me about kids and me not working, Sarah said, watching his reaction closely. Yeah, she's just looking out for the future. She means well, Sarah. You know how moms are, Kevin said, brushing it off as he took a sip of his champagne. But you know I'm not planning to quit my job, right? Even when we have kids, Sarah pressed, needing him to understand. Kevin paused, his face serious. We'll see, Sarah. Things change. We'll do what's best for our family. After their wedding, Kevin suggested they move to a larger apartment closer to his work at the car sales company. The place was nice and bigger than their old one, but it was right next door to his parents' house. Sarah had her suspicions about why he chose this particular spot, but she agreed, hoping for the best. Once they settled in, the reality of their new life together began to surface. Kevin started bringing up his idea of a traditional family more often, where he would be the breadwinner and Sarah would handle the house and, eventually, the kids. One evening, they sat down with their finances spread across the dining table, a mess of bills and budgets under the dim light. Sarah tried to show him how keeping both their jobs was more beneficial, especially with the economy being unstable. Look at these numbers, Kevin. With both incomes, we're not just getting by, we're saving. It makes no sense for me to quit my job, she said, pointing at the spreadsheet. Kevin shook his head, pushing the papers away slightly. It's not just about the money, Sarah. It's about having a real family life. You know, like my parents had. Sarah sighed, her frustration growing. But it's not the past, Kevin. Things are different now. We both need to contribute. He didn't seem convinced, and the discussion ended with a heavy silence. The situation became even more complicated with his mother, Mrs. Frank, living so close. She dropped by often, unannounced, each visit bringing a new critique about how Sarah was managing their home. One afternoon, Sarah was sorting through work emails when Mrs. Frank came in without a word. She immediately started inspecting the house, wiping her finger along the bookshelf to check for dust. "Sarah, you really should focus more on keeping a cleaner house. A dusty home isn't a healthy home," she said sharply. Sarah clenched her teeth, trying to stay calm. "I cleaned yesterday, Mrs. Frank, and I work full-time. It's just a little dust." "That's just it, you work too much. If you were home more, maybe things wouldn't slip through," Mrs. Frank countered, moving over to the linen closet and pulling out a sheet to check for signs of improper laundering. Sarah followed her, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "I manage my time just fine, Mrs. Frank. Kevin and I are both happy with how things are." Mrs. Frank tooted, shaking her head, and moved to the kitchen to scrutinize the contents of their fridge. A woman's place is taking care of her home and her husband. These modern ideas about women needing careers are nonsense. Every comment stung, and Sarah felt her defenses rise. "Maybe that worked for you, but I'm not you. I'm not just going to quit my job to become someone I'm not." When Kevin came home that evening, Sarah tried to explain how suffocating his mother's visits were becoming. He listened, but his response chilled her. "Mom's just trying to help, Sarah. She has a lot of experience running a home. But it's our home, not hers." "I need you to stand up for me, for us," Sarah pleaded. Kevin looked torn but finally said, "She's my mom, Sarah. She means well. We should at least consider her advice." The argument that night was long and painful. They went to bed angry, marking the start of many silent nights. As the days turned into weeks, Sarah felt more like an intruder in her own home, constantly judged and found wanting. The pressure to conform to outdated ideas of what a wife should be was relentless, and her resolve to maintain her independence was tested every day. As the months went by, Kevin's nagging about Sarah not pulling her weight at home increased. He would come home from work, look around with a scowl, and comment on the dusty shelves or the dinner that was either too bland or overcooked because Sarah had rushed it after a long day at the publishing house. His favorite refrain became, "If you can't manage both, maybe you shouldn't be working." One evening, after a particularly harsh critique of some slightly undercooked pasta, Kevin let it drop. "Sarah, I'm serious. If you can't meet me halfway and take care of the house properly, maybe we should rethink this whole arrangement," he said, implying that divorce was on the table. Despite everything, Sarah loved Kevin and didn't want their marriage to fail over this. So she made a decision that pained her deeply. The next day, she talked to her boss, Sarah, about quitting her job to become a full-time housewife. Sarah was shocked and tried to persuade her otherwise. "Sarah, you're one of our best. Are you sure about this?" she asked, concern etched on her face. "I don't see any other way, Sarah. I have to try to make things work at home," Sarah admitted, feeling defeated. Sarah, ever the problem solver, proposed a compromise. "What if you could work from home and manage your projects remotely? It's becoming more common now. You wouldn't have to quit." The idea seemed like a lifeline, so Sarah agreed to the arrangement but decided not to tell Kevin. Instead, she told him she had resigned. He was overjoyed, thinking she had chosen their home life over her career. So Sarah started her new role as a housewife, seeing Kevin off to work each morning and greeting him when he came home. But as soon as he left, she powered up her laptop and dove into her editing work. It was a strange double life, but it worked. Sarah saved the money she earned from her remote job in a separate bank account, just in case. However, living on just Kevin's salary proved tougher than they thought. Despite Sarah's best efforts to economize, 3 months later, they were scraping the bottom of the barrel. She tried to bring up the topic gently. "Kevin, I think it might be necessary for me to go back to work. We're running through our savings too fast." Kevin's reaction was swift and angry. "That's because you're spending too much. You need to learn how to save properly," he snapped. Sarah was stunned. She hadn't bought anything for herself in months, and always hunted for the cheapest deals at the supermarket. His words hurt deeply, mixing anger and humiliation inside her. The next day, his mother came over with a mission to teach Sarah proper budgeting. She dragged Sarah to the store and pointed out the cheapest, often poorest quality, products. Buy these, Sarah. Stop wasting money on expensive stuff, she lectured as they walked down the aisles. Back home, she showed Sarah how to dilute dish soap to make it last longer. You use too much. You need to make do with less, she instructed, her tone patronizing. She even started checking Sarah's receipts, scolding her for any purchase she deemed unnecessary. Mrs. Frank's disapproval seemed never-ending. Why are you buying this? Just stick to the basics, she would say, shaking her head in disapproval. Living like this was unbearable. Every day felt more suffocating than the last. Sarah was losing her sense of self to their imposed austerity, trapped under constant surveillance. The situation was becoming untenable. She felt confined in a life of pretended submission, with every part of her screaming for escape. But for now, she held on, biding her time and carefully planning her next steps. Everything reached a boiling point one drizzly Tuesday evening. Sarah was on the phone in the living room, pouring her heart out to her mom. I just don't know how much more I can take, Mom. His mother is constantly over here teaching me how to stretch $1 until it screams. I get it, we need to save, but this is too much. Her mom's voice was a mix of concern and anger. Sarah, that's not normal. You need to have a conversation with Kevin about boundaries. It's your home too, not just his or his mother's playground. Just as Sarah was nodding, feeling a bit strengthened by her mom's support, Kevin stormed in from the other room, his face red with anger. He must have overheard her complaining. He snatched the phone right out of Sarah's hand. A wife shouldn't be complaining about her husband and mother-in-law like some street gossip. He snapped into the phone before hanging up. Sarah was shocked, her hand shaking slightly. Kevin, you can't just grab my phone and talk to my mom like that. Oh, I can't? Maybe if you had some respect for us, I wouldn't have to, he retorted, his voice rising. Sarah could see the veins in his neck bulging. Kevin, listen to yourself. Can't you see this isn't healthy? She pleaded, hoping to reach some part of him that remembered what love felt like, but he was beyond reason. Healthy? My mom was right. I should never have married you, he spouted out, his words cutting deeper than Sarah expected. That's enough, Kevin. I'm your wife, not some puppet you and your mom can control, she snapped back, her anger flaring. Then act like it or leave, he shouted, his face inches from hers. Sarah stared at him, disbelief and sadness warring inside her. You want me to leave? It's 4 a.m. It's dark and pouring rain outside. If you don't like how things are, then yes, get out, he replied coldly, his eyes unyielding. Sarah knew then that nothing she said would change his mind or the situation. Shaking, she grabbed a few essentials, her laptop, some clothes, and her phone. When she went for her purse, Kevin was quicker, snatching it away. You think you're leaving with this? I earned this money, not you. Fine, keep it, Sarah said, her voice hollow. She couldn't believe this was happening. She called a taxi and waited by the door, her heart pounding. The taxi pulled up and Sarah stepped out into the cold night air, drenched by the rain. As she climbed into the car, a strange calm settled over her. She was doing this. She was leaving. At the hotel, as Sarah lay in the unfamiliar bed, she felt a surge of relief amidst the turmoil. Despite everything, she hadn't quit her job. Her secret savings account, unknown to Kevin, was now her lifeline. As dawn broke, Sarah got up, the weight of her decision pressing down on her. Today was the day she would take control back. She had an appointment with a lawyer to discuss filing for divorce. It felt surreal, like a scene from someone else's life. The lawyer's office was a stark, unassuming place tucked between a row of old brick buildings. Inside, Mr. Collins, her lawyer, was a straightforward man who wasted no time. Let's get down to business, he said as soon as Sarah sat down. You're here to file for divorce, correct? Yes, Sarah confirmed, her voice steadier than she expected. I can't go back to the way things were. Mr. Collins nodded seriously. All right. I'll need all the details. Any joint accounts, property, anything that needs untangling. They spent the next hour going over everything. Mr. Collins explained the legal process, what Sarah could expect, and what her rights were. He was thorough, ensuring Sarah understood every step before drawing up the necessary documents. "You'll need to serve these to your husband," he instructed, handing her an envelope sealed with a stamp that felt like the seal on her old life. Armed with the divorce papers, Sarah went back to the apartment she had shared with Kevin. He was still asleep, probably exhausted from the previous night's fallout. The apartment felt different as Sarah packed her things. Every item she tucked away marked the end of another shared chapter. By the time she finished packing, Kevin stirred awake and wandered into the kitchen, his eyes blurry and confused by the sight of Sarah's bags piled by the door. "What's going on?" he mumbled, scratching his head. Sarah didn't have much to say. Her actions spoke louder than words. Instead of answering, she handed him the envelope. "These are for you," she said, her voice betraying none of the emotions she felt inside. Kevin tore open the envelope, his frown deepening as he read the contents. "Divorce?" he laughed, disbelief coloring his tone. "You think you can just walk out and everything will be all right?" He looked up from the papers, his eyes cold. "Come back when you're ready to apologize, and maybe I'll consider taking you back. But remember, you'll have to listen to my mother from now on." The absurdity of his words almost made Sarah laugh, but she kept it in check. "I'm not coming back, Kevin. I'm done. We're done." Walking out of that apartment, the air felt different, crisper, almost hopeful. Sarah went straight to the new place she had rented days before. It was small, but entirely hers, a place where she could start rebuilding. Each step felt heavy but right. A few weeks after moving in, Sarah returned to the office, immersing herself in the whirlwind of publishing deadlines and author meetings. Being around her colleagues again, feeling the familiar rush of approaching deadlines, reignited a spark in her that she thought she had lost. Days at the office blended into weeks, and before she knew it, Sarah was back in her groove, managing manuscripts and deadlines with renewed efficiency. The personal upheavals she'd faced had given her a fresh perspective, and she felt genuinely good to be back. The familiar landscape of texts and typos was more comforting than she had imagined it would be. During this time, Sarah reconnected with old friends, people who had known her long before Kevin. They met for drinks after work and shared meals on weekends. Slowly, Sarah began to feel more like herself than she had in years. The laughter and lighthearted teasing grounded her, and in their company, she rediscovered parts of herself that she had forgotten. A few months into this new phase, Sarah received an unexpected call from Kevin. His voice was awkward and tinged with desperation. "Hey, Sarah. I got laid off." "Things are pretty rough," he began, stumbling over his words. "I was thinking maybe you could help me out financially." His request hung in the air, audacious and somewhat insulting, given their history. "And maybe we could start over a rebuild. I mean, if you apologize to me and my mom, and show some commitment here," he added, his voice trailing off, hopeful yet uncertain. Sarah couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of his proposal. "Kevin, you think I'd come back to support you and your parents after you kicked me out? Now that you're out of a job, suddenly all your high and mighty principles are gone." There was a pause. "So that's a no?" he asked, sounding smaller and deflated. "Kevin, I'm doing well, and honestly, I'm enjoying my freedom too much to give it up again. I hope you find your feet, but it won't be with me." Sarah's words were firm, sealing the end of their relationship. After hanging up, she felt a surge of empowerment. Kevin's call, although ridiculous, had reaffirmed something vital for Sarah. She was truly free now, and no offer or plea was going to change that.